where to start. As far back as I can remember, even when I was very little, I told my parents that I wasn't from there. I was from somewhere called Neath. And that could they take me back there, because I'd really like to go back and have a look. And I would talk about this other place. And they thought that I had a really vivid imagination. And I would never dare to talk about it to anybody else because my parents would get very upset. And so when we discussed these things, it was always my dream world that we would talk about. So my dreams started when I was very young, very, very young. And my parents thought they were my imagination. But they continued all my life. And when I got to a reasonable age, I would write them in journals. I was reluctant to tell anybody about them except my closest friends because they would think I was crazy. Before I retired, I was a chartered accountant. And so if anyone from my work were to find out about my dreams, it could have ruined my career. It was important for me to not come across as if I was, well, crazy, for lack of a better word. So it was not until I retired that I decided to do something about my journals with all the dreams in them. So I thought that I would just tell the nice, fun stories from the dreams on YouTube. And eventually I would, cover all my journals, and it would be interesting for people. And of course, as I progressed, I got a lot of feedback from people. But people wanted to know specifics. What did I see? What did the machines look like? How was flight? How was I able to fly? How was I able to cut stone? And so my channel evolved. That seems to be what people have wanted on the YouTube channel. They want more about the specifics. So that's been what I've been doing, and not the fun stories, which I thought people would like initially. What has become evident to me now is that it was a regression to a previous life. But most of my life, I really thought it was just really amazing dreams. So in my regressions, I was born in a place called Kron, and that's well over 30,000 years ago. As a child, my family and everyone in my village moved to a new location for safety, and it was called Tantal in my dreams. But I'm pretty sure it has so many similarities to what people call Atlantis today that in my mind, I think it is Atlantis. But I never heard the word Atlantis ever used in any of my regressions. It's difficult to explain what happened at the start because there were certain factors that made the civilization possible. And those factors were, firstly, the invention or the discovery of techniques for levitation and vibrational frequency for stone cutting. And next was the longevity, the ability to extend life and live for a very long time. So if you die of an accident, not of old age. And the next factor is education. 12 universities were set up. So there were 10 different locations for the culture. The first being Tantal, which had 3 of the universities. And the other locations were around the world. If you wish, I can talk about that, but that would take a long time. So the fourth, and what I think is the most important factor for the success, was the fact that the culture, the original culture from Kron, was a gentle culture of loving the earth, loving each other, and not hurting, not a hurtful culture. Vegetarian, pacifist. And because it was a very gentle culture, when technology was added, it wasn't added with war. It was added with defense, but never to hurt or do anything that could cause damage, but to protect the culture from the people who were primitive. The time frame for my regressions spans a very long time. And during that time frame, there were 3 eras. The first era was the Era of Uran. It was, in my opinion, the best era. But one of the problems was that the leader requested that everyone be limited to 1 child in their lifetime. And eventually people weren't happy. So the Era of Uran, even though it was a wonderful era, eventually ended because people wanted to have more children. There was a few other little things as well, but that was the main thing. But the problem that they didn't realize was that because the lives were so long, if they could have unlimited number of children, after a very short period of time, the population would have been ridiculous. So they didn't find that out until the next era, the Era of Bela. Now, Bela was also from Kron, so because there were other people called Bela, he was called Bela of Kron. When Bela took over, people could have as many children as they liked. And very quickly, the population grew and resources became stretched. So because of that, things started to change a lot. And it was still a really wonderful place, but there was a lot of people in a small area. There was a terrible civil unrest eventually, and there was a revolution, and another leader took over called Japay. I was no longer in Tantal at that point. I had left before Japay took over. But Japay was very egotistical and decided that he wanted to be treated as a god, the way the primitives had gods. And there's so much that happened that changed everything about Tantal. Prior to Japay, it was a gentle, an atheist culture, basically. They believed in science. Science was everything. And at the final era of this culture, their beliefs obviously were mainly based on fear. And eventually the whole place was destroyed. But that's a very long story. The legacy comes from the various universities around the world and the people who survived. I think one of those main locations was in South America, in a place called Tehut. And hopefully, eventually, we will find a location that matches it. Tehut was the center of philosophy and for chemistry. To my people in my regressions, the two were interchangeable. And so, as you might imagine, it was pretty important. The universities are so much an important part of Tantal because people had to go to the universities. So because lives were so much longer, when a child was born, the first 20 years, the child was just with the parents. No school. They were just educated naturally by the parents. The intention was that the first 20 years of any life should be enjoyable, should be fun, should be a great pleasure for both the parents and the child. Then started the university system, and there were 12 universities over 10 locations. The first university was just called the Great Institute. It was the very first university of Tantal, and it was where all the other universities were originally located before they were decentralized. So the Great Institute was the Institute for Mathematics. It was considered that mathematics was the core around which all the other institutes built upon. The other institutes within Tantal, one was called API, which is the School of Medicine, and the other was called BESA, which was the School of Enjoyment. But don't get me wrong, it covered the enjoyment of food, arts, literature, music, dance, and recreational drugs. So enjoyment did cover quite a lot. But those are the three universities that were within Tantal. Then outside of Tantal, there was Qum. And that, I believe, is Egypt. It was the University for Applied Energy. Now, I say applied energy because there was a different university for theoretical energy. The theoretical energy was called Peri. In Qum, there were pyramids, but there were no pyramids in Tantal. There were pyramid obelisks, but no pyramids. So the other universities, some of them also had pyramids, especially if they were a long way away from the main source of energy, which was in Qum. Another university, I'm just trying to remember them all. So we have, next would be NEB, which is the Building Institute, the Building and Mining Institute. It's one of my favorites for my regressions because I had such a good time there. There's also one called, well, it had two names. It had Kata and Tena, and I'm not totally sure which one came first. It somehow changed names along the way. And it was the Institute for Primitive Studies and Animal Studies. Then there was Neath, which is where I spent a lot of time after I left Tantal, and it was the Institute of Agriculture and Nutrition. As I mentioned, Peri was the Institute of Theoretical Energy. So in Peri, all the different types of energy were evaluated and scientists would look at all kinds of things. But it wasn't until it got to Chem that they worked out what the practical use would be. There was another one called Peosa, which was the study of oceans and water. I personally think it's located somewhere in the vicinity of Cuba. Another institute, which I haven't really talked about very much because it seems it's too unbelievable, but it's one I've had some amazing dreams about. But I haven't actually mentioned it in any of my episodes, have I?
Do it, please do it.
Okay. It's called LIM, and it just seems so ridiculous that I'm embarrassed, but it's like a flying city. Because it was such an unusual place, people would enjoy going there for a holiday. So I had some amazing regression holidays in this place. And it was the Institute for Air and Earth Sciences. And another one of the universities was called Phoebe, and I think that was located in the UK, maybe Doggerland, because of the White Cliffs. And it was for celestial studies. So Phoebe was situated at the end. There was a white cliff at one side and a mostly grown cliff at the other side. And they met in the middle, and there was this enormous white building with really, really big steps. I don't know why the steps were so high. It was not easy to climb up them. It was not a natural climb. And at the top, when you went into the building, it had big pillars at the front and it had a dome over the top. And it was extremely beautiful, very white. The story of one of my regressions in Phoebe, which I put on my channel, I describe how I would fly to get to the university. And basically everybody had a levitation device, a simple one. Certainly in the early days, you just wrapped it around the middle of your body and you could become lighter than air. So everyone also wore beautiful capes. To get anywhere, your personal device, you would just go upwards using your levitation device, and then whichever direction you want to go in, you would glide down, reducing your buoyancy, and head in the direction you wanted to go in. But that was only the personal devices. There were also proper flying machines, and we also had submersibles. In the early days, we didn't have boats or vehicles. As you can imagine, it was that ability to, for the lack of a better word, levitate, made it just so easy to get from one point to another point. And it was only when travelling long distances that flying machines were actually needed. We knew what the wheel was. We knew what it was, but it required, it would have taken up too many resources making roads, and that just seemed so unnecessary. One thing I should also add, which I think I had forgotten to comment on, I don't think we were the first advanced culture, but I don't know a lot about anything that came before. The only clue I've had as to anything before Tantal was that one of the main leaders called Tehut, who also the place is named after in South America, they didn't come from Tantal or Kron. They came from somewhere else, and they brought with them books. I do have ordinary dreams like other people as well, but they're not vivid. They fade quickly, so there is a big difference between these regression dreams versus normal dreams. So I've actually covered all 12 universities now. I've glazed over everything because it's such... I mean, I'm 59 years old now, and I've been dreaming these dreams all my life. And I've got journals, boxes and boxes of journals. I've got so many of them. So I've just given you a very brief introduction to my crazy. That's a fair question. I can't prove anything, but I did have some experiences in Japan, in the oldest parts of Japan, where I knew where things were before I got there. I said, I had my mother with me, and I said, when we turn the corner, there will be a certain thing there. And there was. And I had no way of knowing that. I want to go to Bolivia because I believe I can find a hidden cave that was dug out by Uran that must still be there. I know where it is. I'm scared and excited at the idea of looking. And there are lots of things in my regressions that could be investigated, and I want to do that. I've ended up doing several episodes on machine work because people ask me about it a lot. But some of the machines that I've seen in my regressions were amazing. There is one that I remember using something that looked like an iPad. And this was actually before iPads became a thing. This device helped me to control a machine that could cut into the stone. And it had, for larger work, there were like ice cream scoops. It used vibrational technology. And there were many, many different sizes to the scoops. The very finest would create a surface that was so smooth you couldn't even tell that it had been cut into. So I tried to draw one of these machines for my episode. It looks very clumsy. But it gets the message across, I think. I think I managed to communicate it, but it's not a pretty picture because I'm not good at that. There's many different machines that I could tell you about. I must say that it's not until recently that I have realized that my dreams are regressions. I've always just thought I had weird dreams. But now that I am retired, I am putting effort into trying to prove and verify some of the things that I have seen in my regressions. I started only about 8 months ago, so I'm pretty new to this. I've been even too scared to show my face on my channel. I'm just trying to get up my confidence because I've been terrified of being ridiculed. I've had a business professional persona for so long that to actually basically express who I really am and all these dreams, it's not easy to do that for me. Well, everybody except the children looked to be between about 25 to 30. We were generally tallish, but not overly tall. 6 footish, 6.5 footish kind of heights. Nothing beyond normal for today. The police force were very tall. They were chosen to be extremely tall, but they were only the equivalent of American basketball players. We were just the same as the primitives, but we had better food and nutrition, and so we were naturally taller, and they considered us, when they saw us, to be very tall. They were just as human as we were, but their culture was violent, and so it was not something we really wanted to have anything to do with. We did try to help them, and we did watch them and study them, but we knew that they were pretty much the same as us, but just not pacifists. So how we looked to them, we would have looked a little strange, I think. And we also, when we were in our own place in Tantal or at the universities, we had unique ways of dressing, and it was quite different to the way we may dress if we were out where the primitives were, because part of our technology was protective, and we would wear things that would make it difficult for the primitives or animals to hurt us. So a lot of the things that we wear had practical purposes. For example, we wore things on our wrists which looked like watches, but they had many, many different purposes. So the capes attached at the bracelets that we wore and at armbands that we wore, and it was very secure. We could also step backwards into the longer capes so that they attached to our ankles, but that was that was a different style of cape. With the headwear that we would wear was generally for when we were outside of our normal areas. So some very interesting hats for going outside, which would act as protection. The earlier years, most people were dark-skinned. There were a lot of people with red hair. As time progressed, for some reason, skin colour got lighter. Some of the various groups that we did accept into Tantal were lighter skinned, and Japay was the first white-skinned leader. Both Bala and Uran were both darker skinned. Japay had white hair and pale skin. Even from a baby he had white hair. Whereas the first leader had very red hair. The first leader, Uran, he had red hair and darkish skin. So people didn't really look terribly different to the way that we look today. But because it was such a long time frame, over 30,000 years, that I could speak of, things did change. Fashions changed. Yeah, there was a lot of different sub-eras within those three main eras. So, and I think I've dreamt about them all. I know the plant. If I saw the plant, I could say, yes, it is. The nearest I've been able to find is a kind of tea, but the root structure, I have not been able to find a plant with the same sort of root structure. The root structure is almost like it knits together. I too am looking for that plant. Probably if I can find it anywhere, it will be in South America. I wasn't actually in Tantal when it happened. To the best of my knowledge, it was a very violent tsunami that finished the place off. There were earthquakes and other things that happened before that, but the final thing that finished it off was the tsunami. And it happened because we were hit by a meteor. But many times. But the one that finished Tantal was the tsunami that resulted from it. So it would take me a long time to explain all the steps that happened before the final devastation. There was nothing. No buildings. No people. There was nothing that I could even recognize except the hills in the distance. There was mud and debris everywhere, and we had received a communication that there was a group in a bunker underground, and we were trying to rescue them. The entrance was totally blocked, and we had to very quickly build an area around above where the entrance was and drain out the liquid before we could even start to gain entrance. We succeeded, and we got the group out successfully. The people in that particular bunker were fine. One of them was the leader, Japay, And after we managed to extract them, nobody said thank you. But everything there was annihilated, so I guess if one was looking for evidence, the place that we dug up to retrieve those people, if I could find that, that would be one very good piece of evidence. Jupé was the kind of leader that lets power go to their head. And he had an opinion of himself that was very grand. And that's why he decided, much in the same way that one of the Roman leaders, Caligula, decided that he was going to be called a god. So that is the nearest to the personality that I can describe Jupé. He was very self-obsessed, and he wouldn't take people's advice. He had a team of scientists, and if they didn't say what he wanted them to say, they would find themselves no longer alive, which isn't a very nice thing. So the era of Jupé, it started relatively normal. He started like a normal human being, but it was like he deteriorated his mental state. It was he that declared war on Neith, and he did some pretty horrible things. But that's not what Tantal was like. That's just one part of it. But there's good and bad in all, if you know what I mean. Well, it wasn't just against Uran's people, because when Bela left Tantal, a lot of people went with him. And Bela and Uran eventually resolved their differences and became close again. So in the Mediterranean, there were lots of different groups that had left Tantal. But the biggest group was in Neith, which we know as Athens today. So the reason that Jupé declared war was because there were a lot of people that had abandoned him and didn't like what he was doing. And so he didn't want them around anymore. So he declared war on... Well, he was actually conquering large parts of the world anyway. Conquering in the sense that he was wanting the primitives to be under his realm, to worship him, to be subservient. And of course, the people of Neith and other areas which were ex-Tantal, they were not having a bar of it, so hence the war. And Jupé didn't have the brilliant scientists anymore. He didn't have... Well, he had scientists, but they weren't brilliant and they were terrified. And he was focusing on weapons of war. Uran had a policy of non-interference, always a policy of non-interference. But he made an exception when Jupé declared war on the Mediterranean, in particular Neith. So Uran decided to help everyone in Neith and around there, and provided technology which was defensive technology. Never anything that could attack anyone, just defensive. So eventually Jupé and his horrible war technology was essentially defeated because it couldn't achieve what Jupé wanted. So he gave up. It was not too much longer after that the devastation occurred. Once the deluge happened and the devastation occurred, I never really had anything more to do with Jupé. And I assume that he is now dead, because otherwise he could not have stopped interfering. Whereas I also believe that Uran and Bella are still alive, believe it or not. I know it sounds crazy, but I actually do believe that. I believe that those are the personal flying devices of the more modern technology that Uran has. It is my opinion that UFOs are just Uran's people checking on us. But that's just my opinion. I don't know. I've not dreamed anything like that. From a religious point of view. So even though the people of Tantal didn't believe in a god as such, they did believe in reincarnation, and they did have certain spiritual beliefs. Of living a long time did have its problems. There were things like teeth, for example, that after a certain number of years became a problem. And also the capacity of the cranium. And that is why there were certain ways to expand the cranial capacity. But as a general rule, the body was replacing all the cells. So there were no cells aging. That one aspect was removed. Well, the first part, when Uran first came up with it, he had to increase the efficacy, and it wasn't until he combined it with the vibrational technology that it actually functioned the way he wanted it to. And that is the sort of device that's used with the plant to collect and put it into the body. Looks a bit like an ankh. So when it was first introduced, there was a lot of people who didn't believe. And so there was only a certain percentage of the population that accepted it. And they started taking it, and as others grew older, they decided they would try it as well, and they would take it on. But there was a very small number of people who completely refused, and they eventually died of old age. The people who were left believed in it completely, and of course reaped the benefits of having taken the cure. So initially, when the older people started taking it, and it took quite a few years for them to revert back to being young. So over that period of time, they had a different view. They had a completely different perspective from the young ones who took it from being in their, say, 30 odd. The old ones who'd maybe been 60, 70, 80, when they reverted back to being 25 to 30, they had a very different perspective and an enormous appreciation of what the gift of having their youth over again. When Uran left, he took his technology with him. So they didn't have it anymore. All they had was the plant and whatever ankhs that they still had, that he'd left behind. They had a big store of them, but it wasn't enough for everybody. So when he left, only a limited number of people still had the longevity drug. Going underground is a very effective use of resources. So you can either build up, you can build outwards, or you can build downwards. And if you're on good solid rock, then if you create caves underneath your civilization, you can store things, it's really useful rather than having to build tall buildings or go wider and take up too much of the land. Well, the more I look into archaeology, the more things I recognize. And sometimes it really, really surprises me. the things that we have left, and people haven't worked it out yet. The evidence is just all there. It's all around us, especially in places like in Egypt and Turkey and places like that. The evidence, it should stand on its own, but what people say about the things that they see doesn't make sense. The archaeologists are not necessarily explaining things that make sense. So it's not just, the things that are underground, but also modern things. For example, the obelisk. We see an obelisk as a thing of power, and people build them today. There are beautiful obelisks in America, in Washington, D.C. I saw a beautiful one when I was in Argentina. They are everywhere. Why? Did somebody just suddenly come up with the idea that an obelisk would be a very nice thing to have? No, it's a residual thing. It's from the time of the Tantal, when an obelisk was important in the technology for the collection and the distribution of energy and for communications, for so many things. It had a practical purpose, but today it's just an icon of power. There are many examples of things that really, there must be more to it, and people just accept it. So an obelisk is just one of those things. It is difficult to comprehend because it's technology that is not within our technological realm. It's a different type of technology. There were many different techniques, ranging from being able to use the machines to do the stonework, and that even in the machines there's a wide range of them, which I have tried to draw them in my episodes. But if we're looking at things that were not machine-based, the polygonal masonry, there were chemicals that could enable stone to be softened. So the stone softening, I do remember how the chemical was created. It was the sap of a certain type of tree, and the people were able to get a white powder from guano, from bird droppings. And even within the stone softening, there were several different techniques that could be used. Some using boulders that already existed, others creating it from as if it was a concrete. And with some of the polygonal work, if we needed a membrane to hold it in place until it dried out. So to make the membranes, we used big stone mushroom-like things so that they would dry off, and they were blown pretty much like glass and then dried. And there is a temple. So there's places like that. It's residual technology. It's what's being left behind, and people can remember how to make certain things. But when the people who remembered how to make the membranes have gone, then all that's left is something that people can only say, well, this looks like a fertility temple. But everyone was so interested in the membranes. I did do an episode purely on the membranes, how they were manufactured.